My name is Noor. I'm 28 years old and I was born into Saudi royalty in 1996. Until September 15th, 2018, I lived as a devout Muslim princess behind palace walls. That was the day my family announced I would marry my uncle, and the day my world collapsed. I grew up in what most people would consider paradise. Our palace compound stretched across acres of manicured gardens, with fountains that sparkled like diamonds under the Arabian sun. From my bedroom window, I could see marble terraces cascading down to infinity pools that seemed to merge with the horizon. Every morning I woke to fresh jasmine flowers placed beside my bed by servants whose names I was taught were unnecessary to remember. I had closets filled with designer gowns from Paris, jewelry that could feed entire villages, and access to anything money could purchase. Yet, I didn't understand then that I was living in the most beautiful prison ever constructed. My childhood revolved entirely around Islamic teachings and royal protocols. Before I could properly walk, I was learning to prostrate myself 5 times daily toward Mecca. By age 7, I had memorized entire chapters of the Quran in Arabic, reciting verses I barely understood, but knew were sacred. My private tutor, Sister Fatima, would arrive each morning at dawn to guide me through Islamic jurisprudence, teaching me that every aspect of my existence should honor Allah and preserve my family's reputation. Islam wasn't just my religion, it was my entire identity, my family's honor, my reason for existing. Every breath I took was supposed to glorify Allah. Every decision filtered through Islamic law, every relationship measured against religious propriety. The women in my family moved through life like graceful shadows, always beautiful, always modest, always 3 steps behind the men who held our destinies in their hands. My mother, despite being a princess herself before marriage, spoke only when addressed directly by my father. She taught me that a woman's greatest achievement was becoming a worthy wife and mother, that our intelligence should be used to support our husband's ambitions rather than pursue our own dreams. I watched her coordinate elaborate charitable events for other royal wives, always ensuring my father received credit for her organizational brilliance. She never complained, never questioned, never expressed desires beyond what was expected of her role. My brothers enjoyed freedoms that seemed as natural to them as breathing. Ahmed, only 2 years older than me, could travel internationally for business or pleasure without seeking permission from anyone. He attended universities in London and New York, brought home stories of late-night discussions with classmates from every continent, and spoke casually about career plans that spanned decades. Meanwhile, I needed written permission from my father to visit the gardens outside our immediate compound. When I asked why my brothers could explore the world, while I needed approval to leave our property, my mother gently explained that men were created to be protectors and providers, while women were created to be protected and cherished. I never questioned why my brothers could travel freely while I needed permission to leave our compound. This was simply the natural order Allah had established, and questioning Allah's wisdom was unthinkable. From my earliest memories, marriage was discussed as my inevitable and glorious destiny. During family gatherings, the adult women would examine my developing features, commenting on which traits would appeal to potential suitors from other royal families. They spoke of strategic alliances between kingdoms, of marriages that would strengthen both families' political influence and economic power. My Aunt Layla often reminded me that love was a Western fantasy that led to divorce and broken families, while arranged marriages built on mutual respect and shared values created lasting stability. I was taught that romantic love was selfish and temporary, but marriages rooted in family wisdom and religious compatibility would bring contentment and honor. The conversations about my future husband began when I turned 16. My father would occasionally mention suitable young men from allied families, describing their educational achievements, business acumen, and religious devotion. These weren't romantic prospects, but potential partnerships that would benefit both families for generations. I learned that marriage negotiations involved dowries, property transfers, and careful consideration of bloodlines and tribal connections. From childhood, I knew my marriage would be arranged, but I trusted my parents to choose wisely. They had successfully arranged marriages for my cousins and older relatives, creating unions that appeared harmonious and prosperous. My education prepared me exclusively for eventual wifehood and motherhood, while my brothers studied international business and political science. I learned advanced Arabic calligraphy, Islamic history, household management, and diplomatic entertaining. I could plan state dinners for hundreds of guests, arrange flowers according to Islamic aesthetic principles, and discuss Quranic interpretations with religious scholars' wives. My tutors emphasized that educated women made better wives because they could engage intellectually with their husbands and raise children who would honor the family name. I spoke 4 languages fluently, understood complex theological concepts, and could navigate intricate royal protocols. But all of these skills were designed to make me valuable as someone's wife rather than as an individual. The palace compound became my entire universe. While my brothers attended boarding schools in Switzerland and spent summers traveling through Europe, I rarely left our property except for family obligations or religious ceremonies. My closest friends were female cousins and daughters of my father's business associates, young women whose lives followed identical patterns to mine. We spent hours discussing which Islamic scholars we admired, which charitable causes deserved our support, and which styles of hijab most beautifully honored our faith. Our conversations never ventured into questioning our predetermined futures or exploring personal dreams beyond marriage and motherhood. Looking back now, I realize how completely isolated we were from alternative perspectives about women's potential or different interpretations of Islamic teachings. Every book in our private library, every teacher who entered our compound, every discussion at family gatherings reinforced identical messages about women's roles and religious obligations. We lived in an echo chamber of tradition and privilege, never encountering voices that might suggest different possibilities for our lives. I was intellectually curious and spiritually devout, but my curiosity was carefully channeled toward approved subjects, and my devotion was measured by compliance with expectations I had never chosen for myself. September 15, 2018 began like any other Tuesday in our palace compound. I woke to the familiar sound of fountains bubbling in the courtyard below, and the distant call to morning prayer echoing across the marble corridors. After completing my prayers and morning Quran recitation, I was enjoying breakfast on my private terrace when my mother appeared at my door. Her expression was unusually formal, and she wore her finest silk abaya adorned with intricate gold embroidery that she typically reserved for important occasions. She informed me that my father requested my presence in his private study at 10 o'clock sharp. This was unusual because my father rarely summoned me for individual meetings unless I had done something requiring correction or guidance. My mind raced through recent activities, wondering if I had somehow offended family honor or violated religious protocols. I thought I was being called to discuss my upcoming university plans. Instead, my father announced my engagement. The irony of my anticipation makes me shudder now, knowing I was walking eagerly toward the announcement of my own imprisonment. My father's study was a sanctuary of dark wood panels, Persian carpets, and leather-bound Islamic texts that stretched from floor to ceiling. When I entered, I found not only my father behind his massive mahogany desk, but also my mother seated in the ornate chair beside him, my paternal uncle Rashid standing near the window, and my eldest brother Ahmed positioned near the door. The formal arrangement immediately told me this was not a casual conversation about my education or charitable activities. My father began with traditional pleasantries, asking about my health and religious studies before transitioning into what he called wonderful news that would bring great honor to our family. He spoke about the importance of strategic marriages in maintaining royal bloodlines and strengthening political alliances between influential families. His voice carried the tone he used when delivering speeches at state functions, measured and authoritative, leaving no room for questions or objections. When he finally mentioned my engagement, I felt momentarily confused because he had never introduced me to any potential suitors or discussed specific marriage proposals. The room started spinning when I heard his name. My father announced that I would be married to his younger brother, my uncle Khalil, in a ceremony planned for December 15th, exactly 3 months away. This man had watched me grow up from a baby, had attended every birthday celebration, had been present at every family gathering throughout my entire life. I remembered him lifting me onto his shoulders when I was 6 years old, bringing me dolls from his business trips when I was 10, and discussing my academic achievements with paternal pride throughout my teenage years. The thought of becoming his wife felt like a violation of every natural boundary that should exist between family members. My uncle Khalil was 45 years old, twice divorced, and known throughout our extended family for his volatile temper and controlling personality. His first wife had been quietly divorced for allegedly failing to produce male heirs quickly enough. His second wife had suffered what family members whispered was a nervous breakdown before their marriage was dissolved under mysterious circumstances. Both women had disappeared completely from royal social circles after their divorces, leading to speculation about confidentiality agreements and financial settlements that ensured their permanent silence about their marriages. I felt like I was drowning in broad daylight, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The ornate room with its precious artifacts and religious calligraphy began closing in around me like a beautifully decorated tomb. My chest tightened until each breath required conscious effort, and my hands began trembling uncontrollably despite my attempts to maintain composure. The faces around me became blurred as tears filled my eyes, though I fought desperately to prevent them from falling and showing what would be interpreted as disrespectful weakness. My mother reached across the space between us to pat my hand, mistaking my shock for overwhelming gratitude. She began explaining how blessed I was to be chosen for such an advantageous marriage within our own family, ensuring that I would remain close to relatives who loved me while gaining a husband who already understood our family's expectations and traditions. She spoke about the beautiful wedding ceremony they were planning, the guest list that would include royalty from neighboring kingdoms, and the honeymoon trip to Switzerland that my uncle had already arranged. When I finally found my voice, I attempted to express concerns about the arrangement, speaking as respectfully as possible while my heart pounded against my rib cage. I mentioned the significant age difference, our family relationship, and my hope to complete university education before marriage. My father's expression darkened immediately, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. He reminded me that questioning parental wisdom was both religiously forbidden and personally insulting, that my education was a privilege he could revoke at any moment, and that my primary obligation was bringing honor to our family through an appropriate marriage. My uncle Rashid stepped forward to explain the political and financial benefits of this union. My marriage to Uncle Khalil would consolidate two branches of our family's business empire, creating unprecedented influence in regional oil markets and international trade agreements. He spoke about me as if I were a valuable asset being strategically positioned rather than a human being with feelings and preferences. The marriage would also strengthen our family's standing among other royal families who prioritize bloodline purity and traditional values over modern Western influences that were corrupting younger generations. Ask yourself this question: what would you do if everyone you trusted betrayed you at once? Every person in that room represented someone I had loved and respected throughout my entire life. My father, who had protected me from every childhood fear and celebrated every academic achievement. My mother, who had taught me to pray and guided me through religious instruction with patient devotion. My uncle and brother, who had always treated me with affection and pride. Yet they were all united in their determination to hand me over to a man who had buried two previous wives under suspicious circumstances. The wedding timeline was already established without any input from me. My mother had consulted with event planners and religious authorities to ensure the ceremony would meet Islamic requirements while impressing international guests. Dress fittings were scheduled for the following week, with designers who had created gowns for other royal weddings. Guest invitations had already been printed and would be distributed within days. Every wedding detail felt like another nail in my coffin. Each decision made by others serving as evidence that my preferences and comfort were completely irrelevant to my own life's most significant event. The nights became my enemy after that devastating announcement. I would lie awake, staring at the ornate ceiling of my bedroom, counting the intricate patterns in the carved moldings while my mind raced through impossible escape scenarios. Sleep, when it finally came, brought nightmares of walking down wedding aisles that stretched endlessly toward a figure whose face I couldn't bear to see clearly. I would wake in cold sweats, my silk nightgown clinging to my trembling body, feeling like a lamb being led to slaughter. The palace that had once felt like a protective sanctuary now felt like an elaborate prison, where every corridor led back to the same inescapable fate. My appetite vanished completely within days of the announcement. The elaborate meals that had once brought our family together for pleasant conversation now tasted like sand in my mouth. I would sit at our dining table, mechanically moving food around my plate, while family members discussed wedding preparations with enthusiasm that made my stomach churn. My mother noticed my weight loss and attributed it to pre-wedding excitement, suggesting that nervous brides often experience decreased appetite before their special day. Her well-meaning interpretation of my obvious distress felt like another layer of isolation, wrapping around my already suffocating situation. The panic attacks began during the second week of September, striking without warning during ordinary moments throughout each day. I would be reviewing Quranic verses with my tutor when suddenly my chest would tighten until breathing became a conscious struggle. My heart would race as if I were running for my life, which in many ways I was, though my prison had no visible walls or locked doors. During family gatherings, I would excuse myself to private bathrooms where I could hyperventilate in solitude, gripping marble countertops until my knuckles turned white while fighting waves of nausea that threatened to overwhelm my already fragile composure. I attempted to reason with my mother during our traditional afternoon tea session in her private sitting room. I spoke carefully about my fears regarding the age difference, my desire to complete my education, and my hope that perhaps a younger suitor might be more appropriate for someone just beginning adult life. My mother listened with patient sympathy before gently explaining that these concerns were natural but misguided. She reminded me that older husbands brought stability and wisdom that young men lacked, that education was valuable but secondary to the security of marriage, and that my father's choices were guided by decades of experience and divine inspiration. When I approached my oldest sister, Layla, who had always been my closest confidant among the women in our family, I found her equally unmoved by my distress. She shared stories of her own pre-wedding anxiety, describing how terrified she had felt before her arranged marriage to a cousin she barely knew. Yet her fears had proven unfounded, she assured me, because their marriage had produced 4 healthy children and a comfortable lifestyle that satisfied all her needs. She spoke about submission to family wisdom as a form of worship that Allah would surely bless, and she encouraged me to trust that my discomfort was temporary, while the benefits of this marriage would last for decades. My desperate conversations with female relatives revealed a pattern of resigned acceptance that chilled my soul. Every aunt, every cousin, every family friend had their own story of initial resistance to arranged marriages that had eventually evolved into contentment or at least peaceful coexistence. They spoke about love as something that grew gradually through shared experiences and mutual respect rather than the passionate attraction portrayed in Western films and novels. Their advice was always the same: trust the wisdom of elders, submit to Allah's plan as revealed through family decisions, and focus on the honor and security this marriage would provide rather than dwelling on personal preferences that were ultimately selfish and temporary. I increased my Islamic prayers during those desperate weeks, prostrating myself 5 times daily and adding extra sessions during the night hours when sleep eluded me. I begged Allah for help, for intervention, for some sign that this marriage was not His will for my life. I recited every verse about divine mercy and protection that I had memorized throughout my religious education, hoping that somehow my devotion would move heaven to alter my circumstances. Yet I felt only silence echoing back from my prayers, an emptiness that made me wonder if Allah was distant or if I was somehow unworthy of His intervention in my suffering. The silence from my prayers began creating cracks in my religious certainty. If Allah was all-powerful and all-merciful, why would He allow His faithful daughter to be forced into a marriage that filled her with such dread? If Islam truly honored women as precious jewels, deserving protection and respect, why did Islamic law give me no voice in the most important decision of my life? These questions felt like blasphemy, even as they formed in my mind. Yet I couldn't stop wondering why my faith offered no comfort or hope in my darkest hour. My desperation drove me toward forbidden territory that I never would have considered under normal circumstances. Late at night, when the palace staff had retired and my family members were sleeping, I began using our private internet connection to search for information about women's rights in other cultures and religions. Initially, I told myself I was simply trying to understand different perspectives on marriage and family relationships, not questioning my own faith, but expanding my knowledge of how other societies function. The first Christian testimony I encountered was a video featuring a woman from Pakistan who described her conversion from Islam to Christianity. Something about the peace in that woman's eyes made me keep watching, despite the fear that gripped my heart as I clicked on content that my family would consider absolute betrayal. She spoke about finding personal relationship with Jesus Christ, about experiencing love and acceptance that didn't depend on her performance or compliance with endless religious rules. Her words painted a picture of divine love that was intimate and personal, rather than distant and demanding. I knew I was committing what my family would call the ultimate betrayal, but desperation drove me forward into research that Islamic teaching had taught me would lead to eternal damnation. Yet I couldn't reconcile the peace and joy I saw in these Christian testimonies with the misery and hopelessness I felt despite my lifelong devotion to Islam. These Christian women spoke about Jesus as someone who understood their pain, who intervened in impossible situations, who offered hope when human circumstances provided none. The first time I whispered a prayer to Jesus, I was kneeling on my prayer rug at 3 a.m, having completed my traditional Islamic prayers and found no comfort in their familiar recitations. Jesus, if you're real, please show me a way out of this nightmare. The words felt strange on my lips, foreign and frightening, yet they carried a desperate honesty that my ritualistic Islamic prayers had somehow lost. I was terrified that Allah might punish me for this spiritual adultery, but my terror of spending my life married to Uncle Khalil outweighed my fear of divine retribution. October 3rd, 2018, at 2:47 in the morning, my life changed forever in ways that still leave me breathless when I remember that sacred moment. I had given up trying to sleep hours earlier, abandoning my bed to pace restlessly through my private suite like a caged animal seeking escape. The weight of my approaching wedding pressed down on my chest like a stone, making each breath a conscious effort that required deliberation and strength. I wrapped my silk robe around my trembling body and stepped onto my private balcony that overlooked the palace gardens, hoping the cool night air might provide some relief from the suffocating panic that had become my constant companion. The October night was perfectly still, with no wind disturbing the palm fronds or fountain waters below. Stars sparkled overhead like diamonds scattered across black velvet, and the moon cast silver shadows across the manicured pathways where I had played as a child during happier times when my future seemed bright and limitless. I descended the marble steps into our private courtyard, seeking solitude among the jasmine flowers and rose bushes that had always brought me comfort during difficult moments throughout my childhood and adolescence. As I walked along the familiar stone pathways, my mind replayed the increasingly desperate prayers I had been offering to Jesus over the previous weeks. Each whispered plea had grown bolder as my wedding date approached, and my panic intensified. Yet I had received no clear response that would indicate divine intervention in my impossible circumstances. I found myself wondering if Jesus truly heard the prayers of Muslim women, If Christian testimonies about miraculous rescues were simply fairy tales designed to comfort desperate people, or if my Islamic upbringing had somehow disqualified me from receiving help from the God Christians claimed loved everyone unconditionally. Suddenly, the air around me felt different in ways that transcended physical sensation. The atmosphere became charged with an indescribable presence that made every nerve in my body come alive, with awareness that something extraordinary was happening in that ordinary garden where I had spent countless hours throughout my life. The temperature didn't change. The sounds of night remained the same. Yet everything around me seemed to shimmer with invisible energy that spoke of supernatural activity occurring in the natural world. A peace unlike anything I had ever experienced began flooding my being, starting from the center of my chest and radiating outward through my arms, legs, and head until every cell in my body felt bathed in warm light that had no visible source. This wasn't the temporary calm that came from meditation or deep breathing exercises, but a supernatural tranquility that seemed to reach into the deepest parts of my soul, where anxiety and fear had taken permanent residence. My racing heartbeat slowed to a gentle rhythm, my clenched jaw relaxed, and my trembling hands became steady as this inexplicable peace replaced the panic that had tormented me for weeks. Then I heard my name spoken with such infinite tenderness that tears immediately began streaming down my face. "Noor, my daughter, I have heard every prayer, seen every tear." The voice didn't come from any direction I could identify, yet it resonated through my entire being with authority and love that penetrated deeper than any human voice ever could. These weren't words that entered through my ears, but communication that bypassed physical senses to speak directly to my spirit in ways that Islamic prayer and meditation had never accomplished despite decades of devoted practice. As I stood motionless in that moonlit garden, I became aware of a presence approaching me that I knew instinctively was Jesus Christ, though my Islamic education had never prepared me to recognize or respond to such an encounter. I saw him not with my physical eyes, but with spiritual sight that revealed his Middle Eastern features, dark hair and beard, and eyes that held depths of compassion I had never imagined possible. His appearance matched the ethnicity of my own people rather than the European depictions I had seen in Western Christian art, making his presence feel familiar and accessible rather than foreign and distant. "You are not alone," he spoke into my heart, with voice that carried the authority of creation itself, yet gentleness that made me feel completely safe and cherished. "I have a plan to set you free from this marriage, from the fear that torments your nights, from the hopelessness that has been crushing your spirit." Every fiber of my being recognized truth in his words, not because they aligned with my circumstances, but because they emanated from a source of ultimate reality that my soul had been longing to encounter throughout my entire life. The love that flowed from Jesus toward me in that moment was unlike any affection I had received from family members, friends, or religious teachers throughout my 22 years of existence. This love wasn't conditional on my performance, compliance with religious rules, submission to family expectations, or achievement of cultural standards that defined worthy women. I felt more known and accepted in that moment than in my entire 22 years of life, understood completely without having to explain my fears or justify my desires for freedom and autonomy that Islamic culture had taught me were selfish and inappropriate. Jesus spoke to my heart about his death on the cross, specifically for my sins, my rebellion, my desperate prayers to him despite my Islamic upbringing, and my need for salvation that Islamic devotion could never provide. He explained that his sacrifice had purchased my freedom not only from eternal separation from God, but also from earthly circumstances that threatened to destroy my spirit and crush my hope for a meaningful future. The concept of substitutionary atonement, which Islamic theology had taught me was unnecessary and offensive to Allah's justice, suddenly made perfect sense as I experienced the personal love that motivated Christ's willing death for my individual redemption. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself if you have ever felt completely known and absolutely loved at the same time. Have you experienced acceptance that doesn't require you to change before it's offered? Love that sees your worst failures and loves you anyway. Peace that calms your deepest fears without requiring you to solve your problems first. This is what Jesus offered me in that garden encounter, and this is what he offers every person who calls upon his name with genuine faith and desperate need. The transformation in my spirit was instantaneous and undeniable. The paralyzing fear that had controlled my thoughts and actions for weeks dissolved like morning mist under the warmth of divine love that promised protection and provision beyond my ability to arrange or deserve. I knew with absolute certainty that my situation hadn't changed yet, but I had changed completely from the inside out, equipped with supernatural courage and faith that could withstand whatever opposition I would face in the coming days and weeks. Standing in that garden at nearly 3 a.m, I surrendered my life completely to Jesus Christ, asking him to be my Lord and Savior rather than continuing to seek salvation through Islamic devotion and submission to religious rules that had never brought me peace or hope. I confessed my sins, including my desperate prayers to him over recent weeks, and accepted his forgiveness and eternal life that transformed me from a hopeless prisoner into a beloved daughter of the King of Kings. The supernatural courage Jesus had given me in that garden encounter manifested itself just 3 days later during our traditional family dinner on October 6, 2018. We were gathered in the formal dining room, its crystal chandeliers casting warm light across the mahogany table, laden with elaborate Middle Eastern dishes prepared by our palace kitchen staff. The conversation had turned to wedding preparations, with my mother enthusiastically describing the ivory silk fabric that had arrived from Paris for my wedding gown, and my uncle Rashid discussing the guest list that now included royalty from 7 neighboring kingdoms. I listened to their animated planning for several minutes, feeling the familiar panic rising in my chest, when suddenly the peace of Christ that had filled me in the garden 3 nights earlier surged through my entire being. The courage wasn't my own, but something supernatural that enabled me to speak truth I never could have voiced through human strength alone. I set down my water glass with steady hands and looked directly at my father, the man whose authority had shaped every decision of my life since birth. I told my father I would rather die than marry my uncle, and I meant every word. The statement emerged from my lips with quiet conviction rather than emotional hysteria, delivered in a tone of respectful firmness that nonetheless made my position absolutely clear. The dining room fell into complete silence, as if someone had pressed a mute button on our entire family gathering. Serving staff froze in their movements. My mother's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, and my brothers exchanged glances that registered their shock at hearing their traditionally compliant sister speak such defiant words. My father's face transformed through several stages of emotion within the space of 30 seconds. Initial confusion gave way to disbelief, then mounting anger that darkened his features until his jaw clenched and his hands formed fists on either side of his dinner plate. He had never heard me speak against his decisions throughout my entire life, and my public rebellion in front of extended family members represented a challenge to his patriarchal authority that Islamic culture taught was both religiously forbidden and personally insulting to his honor as head of our household. The explosion of his anger filled the dining room with verbal fury that I had never witnessed directed toward any family member, regardless of their offenses or failures. He reminded me that questioning parental wisdom was forbidden by Islamic law, that my ingratitude dishonored the family name before Allah and man, and that my education and privileges could be revoked immediately if I continued displaying such rebellious disrespect. His voice rose until other family members began shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, uncertain how to respond to this unprecedented confrontation between father and daughter. My mother wept as if I had died, telling me I was destroying our family's honor and breaking her heart with my selfish refusal to accept the blessing of marriage within our own family. She spoke between sobs about the shame my behavior would bring upon our household, the disappointment Uncle Khalil would experience when he learned of my resistance, and the damage my rebellion would cause to carefully negotiated business partnerships that depended upon this matrimonial alliance. Her tears felt like physical blows against my resolve. Yet the supernatural peace within me remained unshaken despite her emotional manipulation. Within hours of that dinner confrontation, I found myself under complete house arrest with all privileges revoked until I came to my senses and apologized for my inexcusable behavior. Palace security removed my cell phone, disconnected internet access from my private suite, and stationed guards outside my door to prevent any unauthorized communication with the outside world. My movements were restricted to my bedroom, bathroom, and private balcony, with meals delivered by staff members who had been instructed not to engage in any conversation beyond basic courtesy. My uncle Khalil arrived at the palace the following evening for an emergency family meeting to address what my father described as a temporary bout of pre-wedding hysteria that required immediate correction through firm guidance and increased religious instruction. I was summoned to the library where Uncle Khalil sat beside my father, his expression displaying wounded disappointment mixed with paternalistic concern for my spiritual and mental condition. He spoke about his excitement regarding our upcoming marriage, his plans for our honeymoon in Switzerland, and his confusion about my sudden resistance to an arrangement that would benefit both of our futures. The threats of complete disownment and exile began during the second week of my house arrest, when my continued refusal to apologize or reconsider made clear that my rebellion wasn't temporary emotional instability, but firm conviction that wouldn't be swayed by isolation or pressure. My father informed me that persisting in my defiance would result in permanent expulsion from the family, forfeiture of all inheritance rights, and banishment from the kingdom with no financial support or family connections to sustain me in exile. Yet even as these consequences were detailed with increasing severity, I watched in amazement as Jesus orchestrated circumstances I never could have imagined or arranged through human effort. During the third week of October, international news outlets began reporting on Uncle Khalil's business dealings with European arms dealers who were violating United Nations sanctions against certain African nations. These reports expose financial transactions, shell company arrangements, and diplomatic violations that painted my prospective husband as someone involved in illegal weapons trafficking that could embarrass our entire family. The scandal erupted across international media with shocking speed and thorough documentation that suggested someone with insider access to Uncle Khalil's private business records had provided journalists with detailed evidence of his criminal activities. Palace staff whispered about FBI investigations, frozen bank accounts, and potential extradition requests from European authorities who wanted to question Uncle Khalil about his role in destabilizing regional conflicts through illegal arms sales. Within days, what had begun as isolated news reports became front-page coverage across major international newspapers and television networks. The scandal made our planned wedding impossible because associating our family name with Uncle Khalil's criminal activities would damage diplomatic relationships our kingdom had cultivated with Western allies for decades. My father found himself forced to publicly distance our family from Uncle Khalil's business practices while privately negotiating damage control strategies with government officials and international partners. The wedding cancellation was announced quietly to immediate family members on November 2nd, exactly 6 weeks before our planned ceremony date. My father presented the decision as a temporary postponement due to unforeseen business complications, but everyone understood that Uncle Khalil's reputation had been destroyed beyond repair, and that marriage into such controversy would bring shame rather than honor to our family name. So, I'm asking you, just as someone who lived this miracle, what impossible situation do you need Jesus to handle? Have you ever been trapped in circumstances where every human solution seemed inadequate, where powerful people controlled your destiny, where religious or cultural expectations threatened to crush your spirit? Jesus specializes in impossible situations, in rescuing people from prisons that have no visible walls, in providing escape routes that no human wisdom could devise or implement. The cancellation of my wedding wasn't merely fortunate timing or coincidental scandal. It was divine intervention orchestrated by the same Jesus who had appeared to me in our palace garden, who had promised deliverance from forced marriage, who had filled me with supernatural courage to resist family pressure despite devastating consequences. Every detail of Uncle Khalil's exposure had been arranged by heavenly hands working through earthly circumstances to set me free from a future that would have destroyed my spirit and separated me forever from God's plan for my life. The months following the wedding cancellation became a secret season of spiritual growth that transformed every aspect of my understanding about God, faith, and personal relationship with Jesus Christ. My house arrest had been lifted after Uncle Khalil's scandal made the marriage impossible, but I remained under increased scrutiny from family members who were confused by my sudden boldness and concerned about what they perceived as Western influences corrupting my traditional Islamic values. I used this period of relative freedom to pursue clandestine Christian education that would have been unthinkable before my garden encounter with Jesus. Obtaining a Bible in our kingdom required careful planning and absolute secrecy that could have resulted in severe legal consequences if discovered by authorities or family members. Through encrypted online connections and international contacts I had developed during my years of supervised internet access, I arranged for an English translation of the Bible to be delivered through a network of underground Christian believers who risked their own safety to provide scripture to seeking souls throughout the Middle East. The small leather-bound book arrived hidden inside a shipment of academic textbooks about international business law, concealed so expertly that palace security never suspected its presence. Every verse I read felt like Jesus speaking directly to my heart, with words that addressed my specific circumstances, fears, and questions about life with God that Islamic teaching had never satisfactorily answered. The Psalms became my comfort during lonely nights when family tension made sleep impossible, offering language for emotions I had never been permitted to express within Islamic culture that emphasized submission and acceptance rather than honest communication with deity. The Gospels revealed a Jesus whose love for women transcended cultural restrictions, who valued personal relationship over religious performance, who offered hope to people trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Prayer became conversation rather than ritual as I learned to talk with Jesus throughout each day about my fears, hopes, struggles, and gradual understanding of Christian faith. Instead of the formal Arabic prayers I had recited 5 times daily since childhood, I began speaking with Jesus in my native language about ordinary concerns and extraordinary spiritual discoveries that were reshaping my entire worldview. These conversations felt natural and intimate rather than dutiful and distant, creating a relationship with God that brought peace rather than anxiety about religious performance and compliance with endless rules. The character transformation in my life became evident even to family members who couldn't identify its source but noticed significant changes in my attitudes and responses to stress. The supernatural forgiveness toward family members who had been willing to sacrifice my happiness for political advantage surprised even me, replacing bitter resentment with compassion for people who were trapped within cultural systems that prevented them from considering alternatives to traditional arrangements. I began loving my family more genuinely than when I merely obeyed them, understanding that true love sometimes required respectful resistance to harmful decisions, rather than passive compliance with destructive plans. My relationship with my mother gradually improved as I learned to honor her position while maintaining boundaries about my own future that reflected Christian principles rather than Islamic submission to patriarchal authority. I could listen to her concerns about my rebellious behavior with patience and empathy, understanding that her fears were rooted in genuine love, even when her solutions would have caused me spiritual and emotional destruction. Our conversations became more honest as I shared my perspectives about women's potential and divine calling without directly revealing the Christian faith that informed my transformed thinking. The peace that had filled my heart during the garden encounter with Jesus became a permanent feature of my daily experience, replacing the anxiety and depression that had plagued me throughout the weeks of forced engagement. This wasn't temporary emotional relief, but supernatural tranquility that remained steady regardless of external circumstances or family pressure about future marriage arrangements. When relatives suggested alternative suitors from other royal families, I could decline with gracious firmness rather than the panicked desperation that had characterized my previous responses to unwanted proposals. Finding safe ways to help other oppressed women became a passion that grew from my own experience of divine rescue and my developing understanding of Christian love in action. Through careful networking with international women's rights organizations and underground Christian ministries, I began contributing financial resources and strategic information to efforts that supported women escaping forced marriages, honor violence, and religious persecution throughout the Middle East. My royal status and international connections provided unique opportunities to influence policy discussions about women's rights in ways that honored my family's reputation while advancing causes that reflected Christian values. Jesus didn't remove me from difficulty, but gave me purpose within it, transforming my privileged prison into a platform for His glory that reaches far beyond my individual circumstances. My continued residence in the palace allows me to understand the struggles of other royal women who face similar pressures about arranged marriages, providing me with credibility and access that would be impossible if I had fled to Western countries, where my testimony might be dismissed as cultural bias against Islamic traditions. The ongoing challenges of living as a secret Christian within a devoutly Muslim royal family require constant wisdom and supernatural grace that only Jesus can provide. I must navigate family relationships with love and respect while maintaining spiritual boundaries that protect my faith from compromise or discovery that could result in severe persecution. Every conversation, every family gathering, every religious observance requires careful balance between honoring my family and remaining faithful to Jesus, who saved me from spiritual and emotional destruction. My current mission involves using technology and international connections to support persecuted Christians throughout the Middle East, while maintaining my cover as a reformed but still Muslim princess who has simply developed more progressive views about women's rights and social justice. Through encrypted communications and secure financial networks, I contribute to underground Bible distribution, safe house operations for Christian converts, and educational programs that provide alternatives to young women facing forced marriages, similar to my own previous situation. God transformed my privileged prison into a platform for His glory by placing me in a position where I can impact policy discussions about women's rights from within the system, rather than as an outside critic whose credibility might be questioned. My royal status provides access to government officials, international diplomats, and influential religious leaders who might dismiss similar advocacy from common citizens or foreign activists, but listen respectfully to perspectives shared by someone from their own cultural and economic background. So, I'm asking you, just as someone who has walked through the fire of impossible circumstances, what is Jesus calling you to trust Him with today? Are you facing pressure to compromise your values for family approval? Are you trapped in circumstances where every human solution seems inadequate? Are you wondering if God really sees your situation and cares about your individual struggles? If Jesus could save a Saudi princess from forced marriage to her uncle, He can certainly save you from whatever you're facing today. Your situation may seem impossible, your resources may seem inadequate, your opponents may seem too powerful, but the same Jesus who orchestrated international scandals to rescue me is fully capable of arranging circumstances for your deliverance in ways you cannot imagine or accomplish through human effort alone. Don't wait for a crisis to discover that Jesus is real, alive, and desperately in love with you. He sees every tear you cry in private, hears every desperate prayer you whisper in the darkness, and knows exactly how to provide escape routes from situations that seem hopeless to human observation. Jesus didn't save me from my uncle just to keep his love to myself, but to tell you that He'll do the same for you when you call upon His name with genuine faith and surrender your circumstances to His perfect will.